If you think silver is just a metal you buy when inflation gets scary, you're already behind the timeline, because something far bigger than price action may be unfolding right now, something that doesn't begin on a chart and doesn't end at your local coin shop. It begins inside a Cold War law written in 1950, a law that was designed for national survival, not free markets. And when a president touches that lever, the economy doesn't adjust. It obeys. Here's the public record that matters. On January 7th, 2026, President Donald Trump signed an executive order aimed at accelerating defense procurement and revitalizing the defense industrial base, explicitly pointing to available enforcement actions under the Defense Production Act to secure materials needed for national defense. If that sounds abstract, it isn't. The Defense Production Act is the mechanism that turns national priority into mandatory supply. And it has one brutal feature that most civilians never think about until it's too late. It creates a legal front of the line, and the military stands at the front. Now connect that to what came earlier. In March 2025, Trump issued Executive Order 14241, Immediate Measures to Increase American Mineral Production, which delegates Defense Production Act authorities to accelerate domestic mineral output through financing, purchase commitments, and strategic coordination with the Department of Defense and the development finance apparatus. That's not a headline. That's infrastructure. It's the quiet, bureaucratic machinery that allows the government to move money, write contracts, and lock up future supply before the public even knows an auction is happening. And here's where it turns from paperwork into panic. Insiders in the metals and defense procurement world are whispering about a scale that would be historic. A strategic acquisition program centered on silver, with figures as high as 500 million ounces being cited in off-record chatter. Let's be extremely precise. You will not find a press conference where someone says, "We're seizing 500 million ounces." Governments don't announce moves like that until after the market has been boxed in. What you do see, what investigators watch for, are the policy triggers, the legal authorities, and the supply chain behavior that changes before the public narrative catches up. And that's why this matters to you right now, whether you're a stacker, a dealer, an investor, or someone who doesn't even own a single ounce. Because the Defense Production Act isn't a suggestion, it's a switch. And if the switch is being flipped in the direction of strategic minerals, the silver market stops being a market. It becomes a supply mission. So the question isn't, will silver go up? The question is, what happens to civilian access when the state decides silver is a weapon component and treats it like one? And once you understand what the Defense Production Act actually allows, you'll realize why this moment feels different than anything we've seen in decades. The Defense Production Act is often described like it's an emergency funding tool, some kind of government support package. That framing is dangerously incomplete. The DPA is not just about money, it's about control. Control over priority, control over contracts, control over production, and in extreme cases, control over distribution. It's the legal backbone of what you could call a wartime economy, even if no one uses the word war on television. Under Title I, the government can require businesses to accept and prioritize orders deemed necessary for national defense, not encourage, require. If a contract is rated and placed under the priority system, it moves ahead of private customers, ahead of commercial buyers, ahead of your dealer's restock order. The point isn't that civilians are banned. The point is that civilians become last in line in a market that already runs tight. Under Title III, the government can use loans, guarantees, purchase commitments, and other financial tools to expand capacity and secure supply. This is where the story becomes strategically sophisticated. Instead of trying to buy metal at today's price from today's inventory, the government can finance tomorrow's production and reserve it before it exists. That is how you build a national buffer without bidding up the spot price in public view. You don't buy what's on shelves, you pre-buy the shelves. And under Title VII, the government can compel information. Inventories, capacity, customer structure, storage locations, throughput limitations. When national defense is invoked, the private sector doesn't get to treat those details as a business secret. In an environment where supply security is the objective, information becomes the first capture because once you know where the metal is and who controls the choke points, you know exactly where to apply pressure. Now, quick pause, because if you're getting value from this kind of investigation, hit like and subscribe right now. Not because it's a ritual, but because these stories get buried, downgraded, and memory holed in real time. And if you want more breakdowns that connect policy, defense supply chains, and precious metals mechanics without the usual noise, you'll want to be here when the next piece drops. Here it's another detail that should sharpen your urgency. The Defense Production Act. As broader authorities require periodic reauthorization, the most recent extension pushes key DPA sunset provisions into late January 2026, which means this isn't an open-ended lever in the simplistic way people imagine. It's a lever being pulled inside a window, an active window, where executive action, delegated authority, and emergency framing can accelerate decisions quickly. That kind of deadline pressure doesn't slow government planning, it speeds it up. Because when you have a tool that may require renewal, you use it while you can, and you lock in the outcomes through contracts that outlive the calendar. So when you hear talk of strategic silver acquisition, when you hear numbers that sound insane, don't treat it like a meme. Treat it like a hypothesis, and then look for the evidence that matters. Miners being approached for long-term offtake, refiners shifting allocation, wholesalers tightening supply, mints delaying releases, and defense-linked procurement quietly stepping into the physical market. In a world governed by priority ratings, the loudest signal is often the one you don't hear, because it happens behind closed doors, and the first people to feel it are the dealers who suddenly can T-source metal like they used to. Now we get to the why, because without the why, everything sounds like conspiracy theater. The why is painfully simple. Silver is not a luxury metal anymore. In modern systems, silver is a performance metal. It's an electrical and thermal workhorse. It shows up anywhere you need reliability under stress, high conductivity, compact power, and durable contact performance. And modern warfare is basically the art of turning electricity into decisive force. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for people who want everything to be politics. Because the Pentagon doesn't care about your ideology. It cares about inputs. It cares about throughput. It cares about replenishment curves. And in the last few years, the United States has been confronted with a reality it can spin away. Stockpiles are thinner than doctrine demands munitions. Burn rates and contingency simulations are brutal. And the industrial base cannot simply triple production on command if the supply chain for critical materials doesn't to scale with it. If silver is embedded across guidance systems, advanced electronics, secure communications, satellite components, high-performance contacts, specialty batteries, and countless other defense-adjacent applications, then silver availability becomes a readiness variable. You can have all the funding you want on paper, but if you can't source the metal, the production line becomes a bottleneck. And here is the strategic vulnerability that makes policymakers act like this is a fire. The United States is significantly reliant on imports for silver, and the refining ecosystem is global. That means the supply chain isn't just a market. It's a geopolitical exposure. In a crisis, exposures get priced. In a war, exposures get cut. And in a pre-war world, this world, exposures get hedged by stockpiling. This is also why the market can behave like it's living in two realities at once. One reality is paper price discovery, screens, futures, liquidity, and the appearance of endless supply. The other reality is physical allocation, who can actually get metal, how long delivery takes, what premiums are doing, and whether large buyers are quietly absorbing what would normally flow into civilian channels. When governments treat a commodity as strategic, they don't announce it by saying, "We're scared." They announce it by changing who gets served first. And then you notice something else. Once one major power signals that silver is strategic, other powers begin to mirror the behavior. That's how strategic races start. It's not the public declaration, it's the reaction function. If the US is moving to secure supply, other nations ask what they know that we don't. If China tightens export licensing around key materials, other nations ask what vulnerability they're protecting. And then everyone competes for the same constrained pool, because silver is not produced like oil where you can flip a switch and flood the market. Much of silver supply is byproduct supply tied to other metals, which makes rapid expansion inherently difficult. So when you hear 500 million ounces, don't anchor on whether that exact number is confirmed. Anchor on what the number represents: a multi-year buffer, a strategic stockpile ambition, a shift from buy as needed to control the pipeline. And once a government seeks pipeline control, the civilian market becomes a rounding error, unless the government explicitly chooses to protect it. This is the moment where everyone asks the forbidden question: does this end with civilian silver being halted, restricted, or taken in some form? Let's separate emotional fear from sober mechanics. There's a difference between a dramatic confiscation headline and the far more likely reality of functional restriction. Most people imagine agents and raids. That's rarely how modern control works. Modern control works through choke points, incentives, and priority. If the government issues priority-rated contracts and the domestic supply chain has to fulfill them first, civilian buyers are not banned. They're simply starved. Dealers go out of stock, mints delay releases, wholesale pipelines tighten, premiums surge, and the public is told it's volatility or demand. Maybe it is, but it is also what allocation looks like when a strategic buyer enters the room with legal authority behind it. Could there be more aggressive measures in an extreme national emergency? Historically, the United States has used emergency powers to restrict precious metals, most famously with gold in 1933. The point isn't that history repeats line for line. The point is that governments have always treated monetary and strategic metals differently when they perceive existential risk. If a major conflict, a severe supply shock, or a systemic breakdown hits at the same time a strategic procurement program is underway, the menu of options expands quickly. Buyback's export controls mandated priority fulfillment and regulatory frameworks that make the civilian market thin and painful. And this is where you should zoom in on the psychology of the phrase voluntary. A voluntary buyback can function like a drain if the incentive is strong enough. You don't have to force people to sell if you can make selling feel like the rational move. A premium offer, a tax carrot, a limited time window, a narrative of patriotism and national security, these are softer tools, but they can still pull huge amounts of metal toward the state over a short period. So here, that's the deep question I want you to sit with, and I want you to answer it in the comments, because your answer reveals what you believe about the world we're entering. If silver is truly becoming a strategic defense input, and the government can legally move it to the front of the line, do you think the free market price will be allowed to signal scarcity, honestly? Or do you think scarcity will be managed through allocation, paperwork, and controlled distribution until the public realizes the shelves are empty? Because that's the real fork in the road. A transparent market says there isn't enough, so the price rises until demand is rationed naturally. A controlled market says there isn't enough, so we ration access and try to keep the signal from igniting panic. One path creates a price reset. The other path creates a two-tier reality where paper and physical live different lives. And if you want a ground-level clue that the second path is at least plausible, watch behavior, not headlines. When large dealers publicly acknowledge that inventories across the industry are tight, when mint schedules shift, when subscriptions sell out immediately, when delivery windows stretch, and when wholesalers suddenly behave like they are bracing for something, those aren't at-to-chart indicators. Those are supply chain tells. And supply chain tells matter more than opinions when the buyer with the biggest wallet also has priority authority. So what does all of this mean for you right now without turning this into panic theater? It means you need to stop thinking about silver only as a trade and start thinking about it as a category that may be crossing a line, from investment metal to strategic material, because once that line is crossed, the risks are no longer just price risk. The risks become access risk, delivery risk, and settlement risk, especially for anyone whose exposure is paper-based. If strategic procurement accelerates, the simplest outcome is not a Hollywood crackdown. The simplest outcome is scarcity expressed through friction. You can still buy, but it takes longer. You can still buy, but premiums expand. You can still buy, but selection narrows, and the products the public loves most become intermittent. That alone can reshape the market. Because when civilians sense intermittent access, they don't calmly reduce demand. They front-run. They hoard. They buy earlier than they planned. And front-running in a tight market is how you turn structural deficit into acute shortage. The more consequential outcome is what happens to paper silver in an environment where physical is being prioritized elsewhere. If there's one rule that survives every crisis, it's this. Anything that can be cash settled will be cash settled when physical becomes strategic. That doesn't mean every paper instrument collapses tomorrow. It means the asymmetry grows. Physical holders own an object. Paper holders own a promise. And in a world of allocation, promises are negotiable while objects are not. Meanwhile, the geopolitical layer keeps building pressure. Export licensing changes abroad. Strategic stockpiling discussions, national security framing around critical minerals. These are all signals that governments are thinking in terms of reserves and resilience, not consumer availability. And when governments think that way, they don't ask the public's permission. They create policy that solves their vulnerability, even if that solution shifts cost and scarcity onto civilian life. So if you're watching this, Dante obsess over one number like 500 million ounces, as if the entire thesis lives or dies on a single claim. Well, focus on the mechanism, focus on the legal authority, focus on the observable behavior. Because the mechanism is real, the authority is real, and the behavior, tightening supply chains, policy emphasis on minerals, defense industrial urgency, fits the pattern of a strategic turn. The ultimate message is not fear, it's clarity. If silver becomes a national security priority in practice, civilian access does not vanish with a dramatic announcement. It erodes through priority. It erodes through allocation. It erodes through friction. And one day, people wake up and say, why is everything sold out? And by the time that question becomes mainstream, the strategic buyer is already stocked. So here's where we end. Not with a prediction, but with a warning about how quickly the rules can change when a commodity becomes a defense input. Watch the policy, watch the procurement, watch the supply chain. And most importantly, decide which world you think we're moving into, one where scarcity is priced or one where scarcity is managed. And if you want this story tracked in real time as the next signals appear, subscribe. Share this with someone who thinks silver is just a hobby. And tell me in the comments what you believe is most likely: a clean price reset, a slow allocation squeeze, or a sudden emergency move that blindsides the public overnight.